Evening, colleagues, students, friends and family of our esteemed speaker tonight. It's really great to see so many people here, yes, wrapped up for those that have come a little bit late in waterproof, warm coats and scarves, because it is just yet another storm hitting our midst this evening. But this is really going to be a really excellent highlight tonight, and as colleagues have reminded me, because we've got a Christmas party going on in the eatery, there's a wonderful Christmas market on Parker's Piece for those of you afterwards that might want to go and visit that as well. So this is a really special evening, and for those that don't know ARU so well, I think we're absolutely epitomised by our mission, which is to transform lives through innovative and inclusive and entrepreneurial education and research. And we've got many colleagues right across our community, professional services staff, academic staff, who work so hard and diligently to help us realise this mission. And tonight, the focus is going to be on academic staff, but in particular, one esteemed member of our academic community. Academics have many roles that they play in an organisation. We think very, very carefully about how we can design, inspire current curricula with professional experiences to support learners achieve, develop themselves, realise their aspirations, and leave our community with really excellent graduate prospects. And that's around the education that we do, the course leadership we do, the insights from our expert academics in enabling us to do that. And as academics also, we can engage with the wider public to disseminate, create new knowledge and disseminate it in ways that are really easily and accessibly understood. And also we have a major role in creating and disseminating new knowledge and new understanding. And as part of doing all of those things, we never do them on our own, so we work in course teams, we collaborate on our research, we work with professional bodies and industries, and we create an element of esteem, and we bring those esteemed individuals in to enrich our community. And we spend many years diligently trying to cover one, some, or all of those aspects. And we recognise this within most universities. We recognise talent, and it's really important that we keep and we support and we develop our talent so that they can do more excellent work and enjoy what they do as well. And so by recognising, we have promotions and celebrations and so on, and part of the academic promotions is at the highest level. It's where not just the university, but really importantly, external peer experts who are often, in the example of a professorship, at least at that level themselves, and who can recognise sustained excellent practice which has created a phenomenal impact. And that that describes those attributes for which we award professorships. And as part of the professorship, it's probably the toughest bit, not making the application to the promotions panel, is to provide a synopsis of what makes you tick as an academic in ways where we have a very varied audience, and we're not all experts, Catherine's area, but I'm sure we're all fascinated by what Catherine's got to tell us. And so I think this is probably the most challenging bit of what you do, but we are really proud of everything you've committed thus far in our community, and we really look forward to you continuing that. And I think from all of those descriptors as to what academics can spend their time doing and enabling in relation to our mission as a university, Catherine's a fantastic example of doing that right across the board. So I'm personally really looking forward to this evening. But I just realised in the days running up to tonight, we probably mistimed this event, but because before Black Friday and Cyber Monday, we probably all could have taken a bit of advice from you. Anyway, I shall leave it now to my esteemed colleague, Professor Laurie Butler, Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Dean of the Faculty of Science and Engineering, to make a more formal introduction. Cathrine, I look forward to tonight.
Thanks very much, Yvonne, and good evening to you all. If it's your first time at ARU, then a warm welcome, and it's really great to see you if you are returning to ARU for another one of our inaugural lectures. And a particular welcome as well to all of our viewers that are joining us online this evening as well. So it is an absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker for tonight's inaugural lecture. Cathrine Jansson-Boyd is a Professor of Consumer Psychology at Anglo-Ruskin University. Prior to joining ARU, Cathrine held academic positions at London Metropolitan University, Birkbeck and the London School of Economics. She's conducted research in wide-ranging consumer areas, including the role of touch in consumption, sustainable consumption, and how aesthetics affect consumer perception. Cathrine has written, co-authored, and edited several books about consumer psychology and neuroscience. Her book on consumer psychology, now in its second edition, well done, Cathrine, is the most used textbook for courses covering consumer psychology. Moreover, her co-authored book about consumer neuroscience with Peter Bright, also of Anglo-Ruskin University, has been hailed as a must-read for anyone who truly wishes to delve deeper into the mind of a consumer. Now, Cathrine is passionate about communicating science to wider audiences as one of the most well-known consumer psychologists in her field today. She's a blogger for Psychology Today and frequently appears on radio, TV, podcasts, and print media. And you might have come across her only last week on Radio 4, as I remember, and not for the first time this year. You might get your own spot if you carry on. So Cathrine is frequently invited as well to talk to companies and government agencies all over the world, and where she gives a variety of talks and also engages in research projects. So companies that she's worked with in recent years include Unilever, Skanska, Disney and Pepsi. And whilst at ARU, Cathrine has helped to secure now over £1 million of research funding. So tonight, in her inaugural professorial lecture, Cathrine will present research topics and findings drawn from her time as an academic to explore consumer behaviour. So with a talk titled Navigating Consumer Minds, How to Increase the Likelihood of Purchase and Instill Behaviour Change, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Cathrine Jansson-Boyd.
Now I'm thinking I'm sitting down again. Right, so I've been told that I looked quite chilled, and now after this I'm thinking I'm going to sit back down and just ignore this or go home or something to that effect. So yes, I am going to talk about this and a little bit of my kind of disparate areas of research, because they don't always necessarily match up. But I kind of want to start by saying, because when I actually announced this talk to some people, I got this response back from quite a few saying, I am not going to listen to something that encourages purchasing. It's wrong. And I was thinking, okay, good point. I mean, it could be. We already heard sort of Cyber Monday and Black Friday mentioned. And yes, if you stock up on endless amount of stuff, maybe it's not a good idea. Maybe that's not what we want to encourage in society. Fair point. But my work isn't just about getting people to buy more stuff. It's also very much about getting people to consuming the right thing, to understand consumers. It's about putting the spotlight on them. So people often think of consumption as something rather frivolous. It is most certainly not, and it is really, really interesting when you actually start scratching the surface. So I think that's really why I'm so interested in consumers rather than anything else. Now, I'm going to cover ever so briefly, because there isn't enough time. I did ask for 4.5 hours, and I was told that's not possible because people will fall asleep. And I do have some students here, so they can probably relate to this, of course. But I am going to sort of cover 3 areas a little bit. They do overlap to some extent, but also they are independent. Now, I've been racking my brains trying to think about how am I going to make this work? How is it actually going to come together? And thought it's not. So if there are any questions at the end going, I didn't get this, what on earth are you talking about? Please do tell me. I'm fine. I can fill in the gaps. I am capable, even though it might not seem so from this. So yes, 3 different areas. So it's effectively like 3 different book chapters, hence my little book on the screen. And we're going to start talking about the thing that was the underpinnings for my actual PhD. Now, I was absolutely fascinated by aesthetics. Hello. Primarily because there's a lot of research in psychology that demonstrates that people buy things because they think they are pretty. And every time I say this, people go, no, 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 we don't. We buy them because they're practical or because I need this or whatever it is. No, you don't. You really don't. That's why certain brands, I'm not going to mention any names now, just in case we happen to have someone online from there, they can charge a fortune for a hairdryer. It's still a hairdryer, but it just happens to be a designer hairdryer. And they often look quite funky, so by getting something that looks funkier, you're kind of prepared to spend £300 on a hairdryer. I've never done that, I want to say. Equally, you go shopping for washing up liquid in the supermarket. If you don't have your general brand that you always go to, which is referred to as inertia, you will look at the packaging and you will pick the thing that looks pretty, just because that's how we programmed. Now, if you ask people afterwards whether they bought something because it was aesthetically pleasing, they're going to go, no. People have no idea, but we can find this over and over again when we're testing people. So that's why I was interested in aesthetics to start off with. And one thing we wanted to establish, again based on previous research, was, is there an influence of color? Because if we're picking things on the premise that it's pretty, then presumably something about that also got to be connected to the color and being something we can see easily. Think about supermarket products. You will go down any kind of aisle, you will look for things, and you always in any setting will look for something to focus on. So we engage in very specific visual search strategies, and usually we start looking in the middle of any kind of point. It doesn't matter whether it's a room, a shelf, this is what we do. And then we start looking upwards, and then across, and then back down again, and then we look at the very bottom of the actual screen or display. So we were thinking, we being me and my supervisor at the time, I want to add, that maybe previous work bearing this in mind means that if we somehow divide a setting into 4 squares, trying to avoid the mid-bit, and we use different colors, putting them into different types of settings, i.e., let's see if this works. No, nothing happens with this. Well, top left. I'll have to dance instead, that works. And we put different colors in these different kind of frames. Will we then get people to see them? Because we know from visual search strategies conducted in psychology, which usually uses only a few sort of distractor elements, that people do spot things. But we didn't know anything about really cluttered settings. And as a consumer psychologist, you don't really care about 2 or 3 or 4 items because that's not a real-world scenario. So instead, we wanted to see whether or not we can utilize certain colors to get people to respond more rapidly and notice them. Oh, now it works, but not on the screen. It works on the wall. That's bizarre. It doesn't come up on there, does it? No. Anyway. So we used basic colors, and there are the basic colors, because we didn't want to use any kind of colors like gold or silver or peach, because they're not generally recognized as primary colors and they're hard to actually identify. We know that. So we used those kind of colors, used a square and a circle for simplicity, put them in random kind of orders in different colors, and we did actually find, following the visual search strategies, if you have a basic primary color, it doesn't matter how many different distractors you put on a screen, so something that potentially can confuse you, people will always spot them better if you kind of put them at the top. So we thought that's excellent. That will be the starting point for us to try to then capture people's attention. So then we wanted to build a bit more on aesthetics, and we wanted to steal something from environmental psychologists, specifically from Kaplan and Kaplan, who always talked about different aesthetics within sort of settings that looks real life. And they identified 4 different components: coherence, complexity, legibility, and mystery. And they said, when an environment looks like this, people are more drawn to it and they find them aesthetically pleasing. Now, I'm not going to go into what this means because I'm going to talk about the things that I'm interested in, but we pre-tested this and found that the concept of legibility is not applicable to anything that we were interested in. So we changed that because every time we looked into it, people were saying, oh, that seems familiar. Oh, I quite like that. I sort of feel like I've seen this before. So we thought, right, let's go with familiarity. It's also an easier word to test because people understand what that means. Equally, we found that this was redundant because people didn't talk about coherence, which is basically how well something strings together. Because the reality is, if you're talking about products, for an example, it kind of comes in one shape and people therefore couldn't relate to that. So we scrapped that as well. And then finally, when we pre-tested mystery, we found that people weren't talking just about mystery. They were also talking about how interesting something were. So using slightly renewed concepts, we wanted to see, can we actually design these sort of aesthetic concepts? Because the reality is, someone like Kaplan and Kaplan, they've talked a lot about that this is an environment and people are drawn to them, but they don't say whether they can be designed. So there's no exactness. If you had a designer who was going to create a new product and you turn around and say, create mystery, they'll go, huh? What? How? How do I do that? So we were just curious to see, can we use very simple components to try to create this somehow? So what we did was we used those 3 very boring figures. We also added a bit to the middle component or the other components so that there was something that you couldn't fully see to make it feel a little bit more mysterious, because part of the mystery concept is that you want to kind of reveal something. You want to dwell deeper into it to find out more about whatever environment it is. So we thought if it's then hidden, and this was pre-tested as well, then people might find it's more interesting, but also potentially more mysterious. And very simply, we also colored those shapes in different colors in red or blue. So we stuck to our primary basic colors. And we then presented 3 different types of screens. So there were either 9, 18, or 27 elements on the screens that people saw, and then they had to judge them on those particular ratings. And it's quite nice, I think, because we could see when we talked about complexity that people actually thought if we mixed up the different kind of figures in one screen, clearly it became more complex. So it was quite easy to see that we can play around and establish these concepts. Again, familiarity came with the squares, if there was a lower number of them. But also we can see when we have a higher number, if we use something as simple as circles, because it's very standing out, you recognize these circles, you know what they are, then people still think that they are actually familiar. So this gave us an idea that perhaps we can design these concepts. We've continued to test this, but I'm going to stop this story there because it's only a flavor of what we did. Instead, I'm going to move on a little bit to my favorite thing in the world, which is touch. And I did promise one of my bosses not to embarrass him, but I'm now wondering whether I should go with that story and the complaints coming your way, Laurie. We'll see. But yes, touch is something that, again, with aesthetics works really, really nicely, because it's the first sensory system to be developed in the womb. We know it's incredibly influential. Think about babies or toddlers or children in general. They tend to explore a lot of things either by chewing, touching, because they don't know what things feels like. So they rely very heavily on their tactile sensory system. And interestingly enough, looking at studies that's come out in the last sort of 10 or so years, there's something that happens around about the age of 10, 11. And they talk about a convergence in the brain. And they say up to that point, people actually are using their tactile system as the dominant sensory system. And then it changed, presumably, because they have enough life experience. They don't have to touch everything because they can guess what something feels like, and then vision takes over. But years ago, I was asked by Disney, in fact, could we do something with a DVD box that actually was a feature of E.T. Now, this was the new edited edition at the time, and everybody already had a VHS copy. For those who are younger, it's something that you will never have heard of, probably. And they wanted to do something special, and I was a bit sort of like, oh, I was still working on my PhD. I had no idea what to come up with. I didn't know why they came to me. I was very confused by this, but I still thought I've got to have a go, right, as you do. So we decided to change the texture on the back of the E.T. DVD boxes. And what we did is we had the normal texture, as you can see at the very top. We had a texture that was like a thick plastic that felt a bit matte. It wasn't particularly nice to touch, but neither was it particularly awful. And then we had a corrugated plastic at the very last one. And then we asked people to rate these on whether they would want to pay more for them, if they thought they were aesthetically pleasing. At no point in time could they see the back of the boxes, so they didn't actually know what it looked like. They could only feel it, effectively. And we found that people thought they were more attractive, maybe not shocking at all, if they had the normal feel. And I'll get back to that in a minute. They rated the ones that was the thicker matte plastic as the second most attractive one, and the one that felt very different, they didn't particularly like at all. But remember, they only felt it, they were looking at the front of the box. Now, more interestingly is that when we were teasing out how much touch influenced this rating, when it was the material that was normally used, we actually found that touch was quite influential. Again, when the material was very different, touch was quite influential. But when it wasn't neither or, i.e. the thick matte plastic, touch didn't actually really influence the ratings. So we were kind of speculating, which again I will come back to in a minute, that perhaps this is because you get this confirmation of that something feels the way you expect it to feel. So you therefore accept it much more readily because it makes sense, right? Equally, something that's almost similar, you will kind of think, well, hang on, I don't really need to tune into this because it's just almost like what I know. But when it's very, very different, you again using your tactile sense to kind of go, wow, hang on, what's going on here? What's wrong with this? Why doesn't it feel the way it should do? And then your perception and your ratings kind of move on aligned with that. After we'd done that study, I met this man, or woman, person, I think. The love of my life, absolutely. Now, this is a visual representation, basically, it's like a neurological map, if you like, which shows the sensory systems and how they're mapped in the brain. This tells us that the hands actually account for quite a lot of our sensory system in terms of proportion. And that made me think that all this touch stuff that we looked at was really quite interesting, and we should continue to build on this. More of an interesting question, therefore, was, okay, so we can see that perhaps something that you are used to feels a certain way, and that confirms that you like it because that's aligned with your expectations. That makes perfect sense. But from a consumer point of view, that's not necessarily very useful because unless you already have an established product, you've got to kind of know how do you design something new to make it feel good so that people actually want to hold it. So if you're creating something brand new, you can't go with previous experience unless it's very similar to something that you've actually seen or touched before, which it may not be. So we were kind of thinking that mobile phones is quite a nice example of this. I don't have any very recent ones, because I think you can imagine what they look like. You probably get your own phones out, if nothing else. But the one there to the very left was my mobile, my first mobile in, I don't know, 1990 or something. And I had this little elephant handbag about the size of this. and the antenna stack up that much above. I loved it. It was like a proper brick. It was great. But it actually felt, even though it didn't look the same, it felt pretty much the same as all of the others. But the interesting part here is there's an evolution almost. And even an iPhone today doesn't feel that dissimilar because it's kind of been a gradual change in the way they've decided to design them and how they feel. So based on that, we were thinking, okay, that's great. So there's definitely evolution, which again then kind of confirms our previous idea of the DVD box, that previous experiences will guide whether we like it or not. But we're still back to this, how do we design something different? So we thought, how do we test this? Because we can't really present people with a new product, because then you have to explain what it's for, and then that will skew the perception and all those kind of things. So instead we came up with the fact that we should use little cards, really boring cards. And I can't thank the participants enough for wanting to do this, because it must have been really tedious. But we had little cards like this. They were about the size of that. This isn't to scale, I want to add. And there was an elliptical grey mask around either a red or a green circle. Now, within these circles were with ridges that were actually different in size. They were either 1, 2, or 3.2 millimeters, I think. And then people had to look at them and rate whether or not they actually liked them. At the back of them were either the same kind of with ridges as what was on the front, or a different one. So we had all these combinations with the fronts and the backs. The backs, however, didn't have any color or anything, but they were never meant to see them, and at least not for the first study. But what we tried to avoid was a sort of unimodal perception taking place. So rather than aligning them in the same direction, we made sure that they were always in the opposite direction, just to avoid people going, oh, it feels okay because it looks the same way. And then we had something that looked a bit like this. And people had to put the card, or put their hand over a card that was at the bottom of this ramp. And then they had to decide whether it felt convex or not. It had nothing to do with the study, apart from the fact that it made them interact with the back of the card, which is what we wanted. So we knew they really had a good tactile experience. And then they had to slide this card up so that they could see the front through this ramp. And then they could just see the card at the front, and they could rate the card from the front and say how aesthetically pleasing it actually was. We did do sort of alternate things, and we changed the front and the backs and stuff later on, but again, I'm not covering that here. But this is what we found. Effectively, when you see something you really like the look of, touch follows suit. But what is particularly interesting here is whilst people, all of them, every single participant had a preference for the smoother looking fronts, they still have a clear preference for the midpoint in terms of texture. So that tells us that when you like something, you also accept the touch more, but there's still a clear preference. So you should probably, if you're designing a totally new product, consider very carefully what kind of touch you should use, and you should pre-test it to make sure that it aligns with how people will perceive that particular item. Now, that also made us speculate further. Of course, this is never ending, right? But we thought, what about, because if vision is still so important, can we somehow communicate tactile input through vision? Because again, this could be quite a nice thing to do, potentially, bearing in mind that you might be walking down the aisle of a supermarket, you might have a need for touch, and I should add that about 65% of the population have a very high need for touch, so we're very much influenced by tactile cues. And we therefore thought we'll design different types of textures, we'll try them independently in various forms, and we'll also look at whether or not you can apply them to something like a tea box and see if you get a similar sort of effect. The overall findings you can see here, and it seemed to be that consistently, if you are creating haptic cues that are quite visible, you need to make sure they stand out enough to actually tell the viewer something, or otherwise they will just ignore them, but it creates a clear preference effectively. So we then took that concept and we applied it to biscuits. Now I'm going to play you a clip because I need a breather and have some water because I'm talking too much. But I will play you a clip of a study that we did that looked at different visual surface textures of biscuits.
Now, does the shape of our food affect how much we enjoy it? Well, the answer is yes, according to a psychologist from Anglia Ruskin University. And when we told our science correspondent, Richard Westcott, that this experiment used biscuits, oh, he was there in a shot. He's in the Lucky's kitchen for us tonight, Richard.
Yes, funny that, isn't it? Have a look at these 6 biscuits, okay? So which ones do you think look the tastiest? Which ones do you think look the healthiest? This is what experiment that Cathrine did. Cathrine, can you explain? So you got people in and they looked at the 6 biscuits. What were you asking them to do?
Well, we were asking them to look at all of the biscuits, and then we asked them to rate them on how healthy they were, whether they were more or less likely to purchase them, and whether they think they were tasty.
So they couldn't touch them, they couldn't eat them, they were just looking.
Yes. So we were basically using touch cues on a visual basis, just to see whether, if they would feel different potentially, would they also look different so that people would respond through vision.
Okay, so here are the biscuits you made. You've actually brought one. We'll just show they were real biscuits, but that's the only one left, and it's a bit stale as well, so we're not going to eat that one. The others got eaten. So which ones did people pick then? What did they think?
Okay, so what happened was that we compared obvious textures versus those that's not so obviously different. And people actually think that when they are obviously being persuaded by different types of textures, they're not saying that they would taste any different, they don't think they look any more or less healthy. But once
Okay, so these top ones, they thought roughly the same.
Yes.
And bearing in mind, they're all made of the same thing, so
Yes.
they don't taste different at
and
all.
they're the same size. No, so they did, and they smelled the same way as well.
Okay, so the bottom row.
The bottom row, however, people said they look the same, but they're not actually the same in terms of the textures on top of them. But this one is the one they said looked the tastiest. It's also the one they deemed to be the least healthy. And once they thought the texture looked very healthy, they didn't want to buy it, and they thought it was less tasty.
Interesting. So, okay, what's the long-term sort of thing you would use this for? Basically changing the way food looks so that people buy healthier food. Is that the key?
Yes, exactly. That's what you could do. So by having something that potentially looks like it's not healthy, then people will think it's tastier and therefore more likely to buy it, which means you could change people's eating habits without actually having to sell them something that they perceive to taste less good. Because we do know that there is a clear relationship between the way we think something tastes and how we actually think it tastes.
It's fascinating psychology, isn't it? Thank you very much, Catherine. Now, Janine, I think it would come a bit of a treat.
I'll spare you the last bit. And I can see Susanna thinking, there will be a question. I know, we can argue about that later. So, finally, this is where I'm doing some good in the world, effectively. For all those who have been complaining and criticized me at the beginning, as I said, which felt funny. But anyway, I am very much into promoting the right kind of behaviors for people so that they shop sustainably, so that they want to reduce energy consumption, food waste, all those kind of things. And this actually started a very long time ago for me. And I was involved in a project whereby we were working with previously homeless people. And this was fascinating because they were living in sheltered accommodation and they were spending too much money, effectively. They couldn't afford to keep paying the bills because these people kept the light on, they kept the heating on, opened the window, all those kind of things. So we were effectively roped in to try to reduce their energy consumption so that we could try to save them some money and the money could be better spent elsewhere. Short story. So we thought, what can we do? If someone actually has been homeless for a long time, and some of them had been homeless for 10, 15 years, so it wasn't just as simple as kind of going in and saying, right, here's a bit of education, and anyway, we know education doesn't work in these instances generally, but we actually wanted to try to get them to understand this, but at their level, so they also felt that they were benefiting from it. So the first thing we did to get them to feel like there was an incentive involved was we gave them £6 vouchers for Asda's or Tesco's or Sainsbury's or whatever they wanted every time they took part in our study. So that was nice. We gave them a little plant, as in the money plant in the middle, to look after and nurture. Whoever had the biggest plant after the 2-year period that we worked with them won a prize. I can't actually remember what the prize was now, but I think it was something rather trivial. It was just to kind of keep them going and looking after something that was green. And then, which is the mirror picture, we also asked them to self-reflect with regular intervals so that they thought about how do they fit in the environment? What's important to them? Does it make them feel good? Is there positive influence by engaging with the plant, for an example? We also had them designing their own little signs, so that every time they left their home, there was a sign that they had made themselves that sort of said, please switch me off on the light switch, for an example. And again, it was just a way of getting them to engage with this. And then at one point, because I must say, I hope no one will take offense if there's someone from this project here, but they had the least attractive exterior environment I've ever come across. So we actually used some of the funding, bought lots of plants, and they made a garden outside. So there was a real kind of I'm involved in a green environment kind of feel to this. And we did find that we could actually reduce their energy consumption with something like 35%. We got them to rate that they felt better after doing this. They loved the whole green aspect. And I know this isn't necessarily a project that you could roll out on a large scale with everybody under the sun. I know that would be difficult. But it was so nice to see that people who really have struggled in life, even they could be motivated to change their behaviors when there was no real kind of drive initially to do so. More recently, I have been involved in a project that was sponsored by RAP and DEFRA. And we were looking at reducing food waste. Now, this was quite complicated, in fact. But we started off by having 2 types of group, an intervention group and a control group. Within those subheadings, we had 2 different groups. One used a food diary, and the other one used a different reporting system of food waste. The reason why we subdivided them in terms of how they were reporting their food waste was because we honestly had no idea what would work best, because there was nothing in the literature to show that one worked better than the other. So we kind of had 4 groups is the main take home from this. The timeline was that the interventions happened during a 6-week period. So not a very long time at all, in fact. And then we had a monitoring period that went on for almost 6 months. Some people dropped out a bit before them because 6 months is quite a long time to commit to measuring food waste. This was also done during the COVID era, so that made things increasingly more difficult because we could never meet these people, we could never interact with them. It was all done remotely, which didn't really help, but there we go. We also looked at their age, the occupations, whether they had kids, who they lived with, their general attitudes of food waste and income, just to see if those kind of factors would affect whether or not we could get them to reduce their food waste. Now, when we looked at specifically the attitudes, we found, because we used a model that's quite common in consumer behavior, that to start off with, they didn't feel as if they were really in charge of what they were doing. They felt a bit lost, and they couldn't quite get to grips with how they were going to reduce food waste. However, once we finished all the monitoring, this went up significantly. So that meant that we had given them this feeling of, I can do this, I'm in charge, this works, and that was actually quite nice. Now, also looking at the first 6 weeks, which is on the left here, you can see that there was a reduction overall for all the participants, I want to add, in reducing their food waste. And that kind of told us that clearly it wasn't necessarily the interventions that was helping us to reduce the food waste. It was the fact that they were engaging with this and they were measuring it. So they had extensive engagement where they consciously had to think about it, and therefore they did better. And it almost seemed to become habitual, because when we were measuring in the monitoring period, they either decreased a bit further or they maintained it. So it just seemed like they continued, they followed suit, and it all worked really well. We also wanted to subcategorize people on their attitudes, just to kind of see whether or not we changed their overall attitudes. And particularly, we were interested in purchasing behaviors, meaning that when they went shopping, they were a bit more frugal. They were really thinking about, am I actually going to buy this or not? Am I going to go for a 2-for-1 offer? That sort of thing. And the groups that were initially not particularly pro-reduction of food waste, and the neutral group, we saw quite a big change in their attitudes at the end. Again, food preparation changed for those two groups as well. So again, we found that they were much more sort of conscious about how they engaged in food preparation. Could something be recycled, and so forth. And then finally, we got those particular groups again to actually not be so bothered about the date on that says need to be used by this date. Because the reality is a lot of food can still be eaten even though it says it's expired. And we wanted them to sniff and smell, you know, and kind of look at it and say, oh, can I eat this? And they seem to engage with that quite well. Now, that's me done. So now I'm shifting slightly just to shamelessly plug some other work. So this is my first book that Laurie already mentioned. That's also translated into Korean, which I can never read, which is very sad. And that's the second edition. And then I've also did another sort of more social psychology-based book a long time ago, handbook that I co-edited with Magdalena Savisa-Riley. And then my last book, which is Consumer Neuroscience, which I did with Peter Bright. Next book will be about fashion and consumer behavior, so watch this space. If anybody is interested in following my general ideas about consumption, you can see me blogging on Psychology Today. Love that, it's a lot of fun, and I can kind of come out freely with the most unusual ideas. So yes, take some with a pinch of salt, perhaps. And then if you feel, and I'm going to blame, Annalie Harvey isn't here, but I'm still going to blame her because I had no idea. She sent me a message as one of our colleagues, and she said, I've just seen you on Netflix. And I thought, I'm not on Netflix. Now you've taken something unusual. But actually, there is 2 programs with me on Netflix. I had no idea. So if you actually like to watch something about supermarkets, all these shows are about supermarkets, then you're in luck because there's a lot of them with me in. Channel 5, all 3 of them, go off and watch. They're lots of fun. Finally, again, like we've already heard, we missed the boat on Cyber Monday and Black Friday, but I did do quite a nice American scientific podcast on that, which you might want to listen to. Finally, before I wrap up, because I think it's time, I can see someone's watching the clock, I just want to say thank you so much to anybody that somehow helped me to get to the point where I am. I think it's very easy to talk about the work you do, but at a university, you are never on your own, you know, whether it's students, other staff, it doesn't matter. You're not one individual, so it's worth noticing. And that is me finally done.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was extremely accessible, very, very clear. I'm going to look to your family first of all. Are they smiling? No. Are they very proud? They haven't heard it all before, and none of them is asleep. So that's a really good sign.
Actually, I don't know about my eldest son.
Well, I wasn't going to embarrass him. So you've left a number of threads. That was really fascinating. Yeah, there's a golden thread going through all of that. I think being an academic, it's quite typical to be critical, you know, when you get excited. I was really fascinated by the most recent work in terms of sustainability. And I think that golden thread is one about, which is about new insights, It's about innovation, it's about impact, and I think really potently, given where we are now in terms of climate emergency and so on, your thoughts, your expertise, your partnership, and I thought that generosity of spirit and acknowledging the fact that we do work as a community, as a team, and even though it's your inaugural professorial, says so much about you. So it's been an absolute delight. Thank you. But I know already, and I think, Susanna, you have been lined up because Cathrine threw the shackle down. You have presented a number of areas, but I think you've probably left a number of loose threads that might provoke a number of questions from your colleagues and from students and others in the audience. So please, Cathrine has very kindly agreed to spend a few minutes responding to your reflections. Yeah, that she's not here. So I think we have a roving mic, so we've got someone here in the top of the aisle. You'll be fit by the end of the night running round. So just put your right at the top. That's it.
I'll move forward. I feel so far removed otherwise.
Thank you very much for that. Just in terms of the sustainability space, what are your interests? Where do you want to take it next?
It's a really good question. So I think, the point just made that we are in a position where we really do need to look at resources, what people do. Unfortunately, I often hear this, but consumers don't really have a big impact. Oh, yes, they do, big time. So we should try, I think, to reduce it on every level. Personally, I would like to continue a bit with food waste because it's got very high impacts. I think that would be really interesting to continue with. And we are actually, myself and Susanna, the colleague who was pinpointed as someone who has to ask questions, and we are looking at doing that at this point in time. So hopefully we can take it forward.
Thank you.
We have got just behind you, and then the lady over here, and Helen.
Thank you,
that.
Cathrine. I was very interested to see your bit about mobile phones and so forth, because all of us have got mobile phones, and all of them, all the adverts you see on TV at the moment, particularly this Christmas, are showing us wonderful shiny phones, and they all have wonderful textures and glass backs and metal backs and everything else, and then we all go out and buy our own random pieces of rubber. So what is the point of all that marketing about all of those wonderful looks and feels and textures of phones when all we do is we cover them up in plastic?
Well, so that's really a sales strategy, the blingy, shiny, magpie moment that we all have going, oh, that's so pretty. Because again, coming back to aesthetics, it's really, really important. And they also got to kind of set one apart from the next, because the reality is they're all pretty much the same, of course. I have a young son who loves the bling and the shininess. He's got a wish list this long with different mobiles for Christmas. And so I can really see that's something that people relate to. The reason why we stick the covers on, apart from the practicality, because usually we tell ourselves it's practical, but it also makes it feel like I've made a choice. This is my choice. I'm putting this on here. I'm protecting my phone, but actually I chose the texture. And that gives you a bit of identity because it sets you apart. And there used to be, a long time ago, not a study I did, but someone did a study whereby they were watching what men do in the pub. And they found, this is about 12, 13 years ago, I think. The men used to go to the pub, talk about stereotyping, by the way, I'm sure it's all changed now, and they used to put things like mobile phones on the table. Now, why would you do that and leave it there? It's before the time when everybody was constantly on them. But it was just to kind of show people, this is my phone, this is what I have, look at me, it's special. But then they usually used to use the covers, again, to make them extra special, because otherwise they will all look the same, right? So it's almost like an identity thing, if you like.
Thank you, Cathrine. We've got another question over here first. Sorry, over here, this lady.
So, obviously this is miles from my research.
Really, Lottie? You don't say.
When you're doing these studies with lots of people, you can look at results according to age, gender, all of this. Can you give me an example of some work where there's been no difference according to gender, and perhaps a study where there's been a big difference that you weren't expecting?
Well, so our food reduction study, there was no difference. Am I right in saying that? Yeah, good, thank you. We saw that it impacted everybody the same. So I actually think a lot of the time it will depend on what you're doing. I mean, if you want to really target stereotypes, you know, we can do that in terms of sex, we could do it in terms of personalities, all those sort of things. It's not really the work I do because I'm more interested in what everybody responds to. So very little of the work I've done has kind of targeted that sort of aspect. And therefore, I never really had any unsurprising moments. Sorry.
Helen?
Hi, Catherine.
Oh.
That was really good. Thank you so much. A great overview of your research career. One of the common threads that you presented was around behaviour change, essentially. So with your decades of experience in this area, what would you say is the most effective way for us to approach inducing behaviour change in consumers or people in general?
It depends on what it is you're trying to change. There isn't one kind of method fits everything. And working with industry, I think that frustrates them a lot, to be honest, because they want us to wave a magic wand and they get a response. It doesn't work like that. It will depend on the product, the behavior, or even perhaps the no existing product, as the case could be. So it's very much about finding something that works, that actually really targets the audience so that they can relate to it. I think if you wanted to try to make more of a sweeping generalization, that would be try to get them to think about things for a certain amount of time. So there's almost, it's mapping on to other nodes in the brain so they can retrieve it easily. That would be my advice. But how you do that, again, that will be incredibly individual.
I was going to ask, thank you, Catherine, I was going to ask almost a similar question, but from a different perspective, in that how can we educate out consumerism, given that it's this rich mix of rational and emotional activity in the brain, and desire overtakes rational thinking, and we buy the shiny thing in the top left corner of the shelf. If we start at an earlier age, can it help?
I think teaching consumers from an early age is a good idea to kind of try to devalue the kind of superficial worth of them, if you like. That is a bit easier said than done, especially with peer pressure in young people. Often, they feed off each other. But if you want more of a high impact, maybe try to educate the parents, because parents can control the younger generations, which you might not be able to get through to. So I'm thinking if you can get people to be more conscious about all the decisions they make. So one of the most common things that I'm asked during sort of Black Friday time is, what can we do to not fall for the tricks? Well, not fall for the tricks means you really have to think about it. If you are very conscious of the decisions you make, then you can resist. But it is about having a bit of willpower. And if you put something down, let's say you're out shopping or even online, you put something in your basket and you think, oh, I really want this, it's 50% discount or whatever. Stick it in the basket, go off, make a cup of tea, or if you are in the supermarket or in any kind of shop, walk off, maybe hang on to it in case you're worried somebody else is going to pinch it, and walk around a few times, think about something else. You will probably find, because we get quite excited by things that are visually appealing to us, that the kind of adrenaline rush that you're experiencing, which you're not really aware of experiencing, will wear off with you doing something else. So when you come back to it, it's much less interesting, and you probably think, oh, I'll come back to that later, and you will not end up buying it. But it's about kind of getting people to the point where they feel comfortable to say, I'm going to take a step back. It's about education. It's about continuing saying what I'm kind of talking about to broader masses in hope that it will hit home.
On a sort of related topic, there's a couple of questions that come in the same theme.
Okay.
It's around online shopping. So if an individual doesn't have the ability to touch because to see things online, how best do you get your product across? Is it the visual?
Yes, using haptic cues visually works quite well. It also depends on what products we're talking about. I mean, often with clothes shopping online now, we'll see people sort of swinging around with skirts and things, and you think that looks absolutely ridiculous. It isn't ridiculous because it gives people an opportunity to see what the fabric feels like. So that works really well. Equally, if you're actually describing things in quite a lot of detail, don't just say, you know, something soft, don't say it's soft. Say it feels like, and then describe the texture, because then if you are quite haptically driven, you can read it and almost imagine it. And that actually helps.
We'll come back to another one online in a few minutes. So a couple more questions at the back. Speak into the microphone, that way it picks it up.
Well, I'll just give you a comment on, for example, this attraction for sort of blingy, shiny objects. How much of that is learnt? How much of it is hardwired? And what happens with other primates? I'm sort of thinking about these baboons in a safari park that will go into a tent and pick up lots of saucepans and run off with them. What component is that is learnt or innate?
It's a very good question. So evolutionary psychologists in this area are talking about that it's actually hardwired, and it's almost like we just grown into it and it's changed over time. There's always been something that's attracted us. I guess what is different now is that we can resist because we are much more aware. But a lot of it, of course, what it is that appeals to us is very much learned. So my example of textures, you know, it's all about previous experience. The same thing in terms of, you know, you're brought up in a household where someone particularly likes white furniture, then you probably learn to like the white furniture because that's your sort of socialization at a young age. So we tend often to have similar kind of tastes to people we are brought up with, or parents, the cases. I mean, an interesting example is most people who buy washing up liquid and things buy the same brands that their parents did. So there are definitely certain things we're learning along the way. And then, of course, society feeds through each other. And I'd like to say that advertising is probably quite impactful as well. You know, it doesn't have to be the traditional advertising. This could be the YouTubers or whatever. But they learn things from various media as well as we go along.
Any other questions from Susanna you haven't listened to? Oh no, she fixed the microphone. Last question to you then.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't need to ask. There's loads of questions. I would like to know, Cathrine, what your guilty consumer secret is. Because people ask me this. I work on food, and people think chocolate. But yeah, so because
do you know what? I'm going to butt in there and say even my advent calendar is hot chocolate this year. Anything that's chocolatey, yeah, that's my real guilty pleasure. This is why I'm never ever going to be super sort of fit, and because exercise, not so much. Chocolates, yay!
Thank you.
So sorry to interrupt you, but it's such an easy answer for me because, yeah. Poor Flavia offered me some chocolates earlier, and I kind of went, no, I'm not having that, because I thought if I start, that's it, I'm going for the whole thing.
I think lots later, you've definitely earned it. So thank you very much for fielding so many questions, and colleagues and friends, thank you very much for asking those as well. So I think we've now got a formal vote of thanks, Cathrine.
Thank you very much. So, Cathrine, thank you so much for that talk. I mean, I think just by the number of questions you've got, it just illustrates, I think, what an absolutely fantastic science communicator you are. I mean, it really is, a pleasure to be able to listen to you. I could, frankly, listen to you carrying on for hours, although I know you don't want to, because I know it's way past your bedtime, isn't it? So, we will draw it to a close, but I just want to just sort of make a few closing remarks. So, I think, consumer choice, of course, I mean, it is just such a relevant topic for all of us. And I think what's really critical about the way in which you describe it is you make consumer choice and the decisions behind the ways people make choices, you make it accessible and you make it relevant. And I think that is just really comes across in your talk this evening, just taking snapshots from 20 odd years of research and just making them both really easy to understand but also really relevant. And I think that's also one of the reasons why you've got to keep being in that public space for the years to come, and which is what you do so well, because the only way that we can really get consumers to understand the reasons behind their decision making, to actually question and to be aware of what they're doing and the choices they make, is by having that conversation in the public sphere. It's not something that can be played out in journal articles or in academic discussions. It has to be played out in the popular media, and that is something that you do, you know, as part of, you know, really fantastic research as well, do incredibly well. So thank you very much for that. I mean, I look forward to the next stage, which of course is helping people to make healthier choices, to make more sustainable choices, and so on and so forth. But as I say, you need that stage where you have that conversation out in the general public to make that happen. So thank you very much. Somewhere we have just a small token of our appreciation.
It would be very large, Laurie. I'm disappointed. You know, as the consumer person here, I wanted big, blingy, colourful.
I was going to ask you to critique it. I mean, even the colours. You were talking about gold earlier on. I'm a bit worried now about our choice of a non-primary colour. But Cathrine, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for a wonderfully engaging talk this evening, and thank you on behalf of all of us.
Thank you. Well, what is this?
So that nearly brings us to the close. So we'd be delighted if you would join Cathrine, family and friends for a drink afterwards. We're going to be comparing Waitrose and Aldi wines, okay? We're not. There's just going to be wine. But you can pretend that you're doing a taste test. So I hope you'll join us for that. If you are on your way home, though, now, do have a really safe trip back. And we look forward to seeing you again at Anglo-Ruskin University in the near future. Thank you all very much, and have a good evening.
Can I just say, anybody's welcome to come for a glass of wine. It's just literally outside the door, so, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all very much. Good night.